Good morning, or I should say good afternoon. Pastor Brandy here. I'm recording our lecture for the third class in our 5 for Pastoral Care for Lay Leaders for our Lower Bucks County Conference Diaconia. The lesson being recorded, or the lecture being recorded, is for this weekend, Sunday, November 23rd. A couple of announcements before we begin the lecture. We'll be picking up where we left off when we were talking about grief, going through the last 2 handouts in that series before moving on to pastoral care images. We'll be exploring 3 images. In addition, this link to this lecture in the email that was sent to you, there is another link to a video on frientimacy. When you watch that video and they're exploring some of the reasonings and understandings of why we are experiencing an epidemic of loneliness here across the country, I'd like for you to look at that in connection with the 3 pastoral care images that we'll be exploring: Wounded Healer, Be a Gardener, and Courageous Shepherd. There's some connections and relevancy between the information received in that video on how could we possibly be lonely living in such a busy world, and those pastoral care images that can guide our encounters with those who come to us seeking care. I did hear back from the Bucks County office on our QPR training. That is now going to be scheduled for Saturday, December 6th from 9 to 11. We will be recording it for the class. However, I'm encouraging everybody to be in class in order to receive that second certificate. It is required viewing if you are not in class in order to get that training, which is a core component of the pastoral care that lay leaders can offer in their contexts. So that'll be Saturday, December 6th from 9 until 11. We'll do a little bit of a wrap up immediately following. There'll be no additional lecture. I hope things are going well with your genograms. I'm looking forward to reading those if you choose to share them with me, and the verbatims, which I believe are going to be coming due on December 6th. If you have any questions about those, or if you encounter any challenges, I encourage you to reach out to me via my cell phone or via email. Also attached with the link to this lecture, the link to the Frientimacy TED Talk, I put the copies of the 3 essays from Dijkstra's Images of Pastoral Care for your reading, and that's just to expand your knowledge in this area. All right, so let's start with grief. Last week, we reviewed the all the different elements of grief. As we discussed, grief is a constellation of emotions. We defined it. We talked about the common elements of grief so that when we see or hear these things, we can identify, this is what this person's likely struggling with. They're grieving, and then navigate how we're going to meet them in the midst of that grief. So we're going to take actually a step back and talk a little bit about all the different losses that we experience over the course of life. I briefly touched on it last week, but we're going to explore it a little bit more in depth. Faith Perspectives for God's Grieving People. This content is derived from a book, I believe it's of that same name. No, the book is called All Our Losses, All Our Griefs. And they just talk about bereavement coming from the root word reave, meaning to be dispossessed or to be robbed of something that belongs to oneself. And then they go on to describe some of the different losses, as in when a woman has a mastectomy, something is being forcefully taken away from her. If her breast is removed, that possession was rightfully hers. When a 55-year-old man has a heart attack and he now has to change his way of living, his diet, his exercise patterns, maybe his work environment to reduce stress. In this instance, his choices and the decisions that he was able to make prior have been taken away from him. Or when parents lose a child, they are dispossessed of something that is very precious to them. In words that have been attributed to Albert Camus, the order of nature is reversed. Children are supposed to bury their parents. So when persons of any age undergo any kind of ordeal, transition, or loss, like a divorce, the death of a loved one, they're often left with a sense of being robbed, dispossessed. Even in choices that they make that are difficult and complex choices, like abortion, or say even a miscarriage, or finding oneself unable to have children, one can see how these losses can be experienced as losing something that is rightfully one's own, and that person experience grief or bereavement. So they also, the authors go on to describe other situations that can carry a sense of irrevocable loss or injury. That could be sexual assault, chronic illness, if you have a child that is born with birth defects. They'd mentioned divorce, but it could also be a breakup of a love affair, a loss of a job. We talked a little bit about retirement, even being an experience of a sense of loss, a loss of one's identity that may have been attached to one's work, the loss of a dream or a goal, the loss of personal belongings in a fire or a flood, even a major geographical move, even things that we choose for ourselves, we experience in those transitional moments loss as well as gain. But those losses we do grieve. And so the opening questions in this particular piece that was put together as a small group pastoral care opportunity for people to engage that could be led by lay leaders if you in conjunction with your pastor determined this was something that your congregation might benefit from, invites the opening questions of, within the past year, what has been your most difficult loss? Or within your whole lifetime so far, what has been your most difficult loss? And inviting the conversation, as we have learned in our prior lectures, is what offers the opportunity for somebody through sharing their story and their narration to be processing their grief, processing the loss, and integrating it into their life. So in this book of All Our Losses, All Our Griefs, the authors outlined 6 major types of loss. And some of them are what we described: material loss, like the loss of possessions or one's home in a fire or a natural disaster, the loss of a pet. So we have these material losses that we experience over the course of our lives. Relationship loss, even if one chooses divorce or chooses to end a love affair, there is grief that attends to that. Sometimes we have experiences with another particular human being where we experience estrangement. It could be being estranged from a sibling, or being estranged from a child, and there is grief in the midst of that loss. The loss of friendships is another one that can happen over the course of time as people change, move, or experience conflict. They also describe something that they call intrapsychic loss. It's the experience of an emotionally important image of oneself, losing the possibilities of what might have been, abandonment of plans for a particular future, the dying of a dream. So I like to use myself as an example. I started performing on stage when I was 13. Most of my teenage years were defined by being on stage and being in the theater, including in college, where I majored in the theater. I was a performance major, and I spent the first 10 years of my life pursuing a career both on and off stage in that industry. And so in my early 30s, when I kind of came to this point in my life where I was no longer enjoying the journey, and I chose to transition into another space professionally, I experienced a tremendous amount of grief and a tremendous amount of loss, compounded by people who had said, "Oh, great, now you're going to get a real job." And I thought, I've been doing this for 20 years at this point, and professionally for 10. I thought I did have a real job. My whole sense of identity was tied up in that industry and how I had defined myself in that field. And so when we talk about retirement, people changing careers, whether it's in different industries or professional spaces, there is a tremendous amount of grief or loss that can accompany those transitions, even if they're by our choice. Sometimes it's a dream, maybe an avocational dream, or how we've identified ourselves. And the authors describe that as intrapsychic loss. There's also functional loss that we experience over the course of a lifetime. Powerful grief can be evoked when we lose some of the muscular or neurological functions of the body, and we call this functional loss. And we see this quite a bit in congregations as we continue to age. People are losing their cognitive abilities. That we're experiencing and seeing more neurological impairment, whether somebody has a diagnosis of Parkinson's, or they're experiencing Alzheimer's, or sometimes it's simply the inability to recall words more quickly, or to be able to mentally process, cognitively process things that used to be very easy for us to do. That's simply a part of the aging process. We see this in the physical losses, and wow, I mean, the medical community is certainly helping us with knee replacements, hip replacements, pacemakers, and everything to keep us going. But even in those experiences where we're gaining something, there is a loss and a process of recovery as we go through those experiences. So we call those functional losses, and often there's a tremendous amount of grief that attends to that. And they impact the relationships with family members as well, where the family members are experiencing grief as their loved ones are no longer able to function in the way they had in the family unit. Role loss. And that's kind of what I just touched on. The loss of a specific social role or one's accustomed place in a social network is also experienced as a role loss. The examples that they give here are retirement, unemployment, promotion or demotion, going from being single to being married. And so those are easily identifiable. But the less identifiable ones would be where somebody in the family unit has changed, and then because they have changed, it's changing and shifting the roles of the relationships that people operated in that family unit. And so often that individual is experiencing grief because they've gone through a divorce, but their divorce shifts how they now function in their family, then shifts family, and then can also create grief among other members in the family unit. So you can see how grief is really complex, not only in the constellation of emotions that we experience when we're going through these various losses, but how it can impact families and other family systems, including congregational life. And then they define something called as systemic loss. Systemic loss occurs when human beings face a change in their interactional systems that alter behaviors over time. And that's kind of what I already just touched on. Examples of the young adult leaving the nest for good, individuals suffering from the failure of their nuclear family to develop and function properly. We often see this if there's mental illness in the family that emerges over the course of time or was previously hidden and now comes to light. And as you just saw in my lecture, all of these losses are often a mixture of losses, multiple layers that can happen, impacting complex constellation of relationships. So they write, so for example, to be widowed obviously means relationship loss, but widowhood also means role loss, as the widow discovers that her social life has changed. She is no longer a wife in her community. If she's been inadequately provided for, she may undergo material loss. And if her sense of identity is dependent on her husband's wife, the change may also be experienced as intrapsychic loss. So again, you rarely experience simply one loss. It's typically going to be interconnected with other forms of loss. And again, that's one of the reasons why grief is so complex. However, when we share this information with each other, it helps us then take a step back in the same way that we do with our caregiver-care-seeker relationships, and even in our friend dynamics and family dynamics and congregational dynamics. Knowledge equips us then to be able to take a step back and see ourselves more clearly. And that helps with our process and our integration of these losses and the grief that we experience when we're going through them. Now, we already defined grief and the common elements of grief: numbness, bodily distress, emptiness, loneliness, isolation, anxiety, and fear, guilt, and anger, sadness. And so these things are really important for us when we're listening to people very actively and looking at them physically and their tone to try to determine what it is they're experiencing and how we may accompany them through it. And then the last piece about grief that I wanted to address is how we accompany people and care for them through it. Awareness is really important. Sharing these aspects of building awareness across our communities are really important. But there are ways and modes of Christian caring and grief that the authors of All Our Losses, All Our Grieves articulate. So they note that grieving is by its very nature a lonesome journey. The resolution of grief requires the caring presence of others. So we may feel alone in the journey. We may experience opportunities of solitude that are necessary for our individual processing. But accompaniment in Christian community is a key aspect of grieving. The notion that time heals all wounds of grief is only partially true. Time alone is never enough to heal what they describe as the ravages of loss. Full release from the hold that emotions of any kind can have on us depends on being heard. All healing process requires going through it rather than around the feelings or issues. And I like to think of that old childhood story. We're going on a bear hunt. I don't know if you've read that to your grandchildren or children, but they talk about how you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you can't go around it, you have to go through it, right? And that's a really important part of grief and healing from grief is you simply have to experience it. And I like to say you have to ride the waves of those feelings, right? And not opt out with, say, maladaptive coping strategies. Often people will turn to alcohol, or they'll turn to drugs, or they'll turn to food in terms of overeating, or sometimes even exercise and over-exercising. And those we call maladaptive coping strategies. Ours is to acknowledge, I'm grieving, this is how I'm feeling, it sucks, it doesn't feel great, and ride the wave of all those feelings, feel all the feels, and trust that when we come to the end, they will continue to abate. And they may come in different waves because, again, grief isn't linear, but that in the course of time the experience will become more integrated. And those feelings won't paralyze us or have, as the authors describe, such a hold on us. And it's really important for people who are grieving to be able to express those feelings and be heard and seen. Any healing process requires going through it rather than around important feelings and issues. Grieving is an interpersonal and communal process. Lonely as it may be, Christian community is an important context for working through grief. They identify a few what they call modes of Christian caring for grief. One is intervention. So intervention is a mode because initially grief is very intense and bewildering. And so the more specific offer of help when grief is acute, and perhaps even that person may be in crisis, better. So it's important, as they write, to carve out time and space for people to do the work of grieving. And so bringing meals over to the home of the grieving is not just a nice and neighborly thing to do, it's an ongoing resource for intervention in the times of crisis. So when the individual whose grief is in the crisis point or acute, being very specific, bringing over meals, sending cards, offering transportation, helping out with the children, asking people what they need. How can I support you? How can I best support you? Sometimes even just showing up with something is an important gesture in that acute phase. Then they talk about supportive presence. So providing support for those who grieve is the second helping response to traumatic loss. Being supportive includes some aspects common to all caring. And we talked a little bit about this, a listening presence, being comfortable with silence, bearing with individuals in their pain, their confusion, affirming and normalizing for them and with them these feelings, responding encouragingly when strong feelings are expressed, meaning it's okay to be angry with God. It's okay. God can hold that, and I can too with you, right? Lending strength when they need an emotional prop. So one must be able to listen without judging, bear without retreating. We talked about that last 2 weeks. Evoke without forcing, and understand without being condescending. We don't want to turn the experience to us. Oh, I know, I've experienced that too, kind of thing. Or, oh, I know exactly how you feel. We can never know exactly how anybody feels. That silence and that support and that reflecting back is about the supportive presence mode of Christian caring for somebody who is grieving. They make a key distinction between sympathy and empathy here, which we didn't really talk about yet. Sympathy often makes comparisons and links between our experience and that of the grieving. Empathy involves getting outside of our own feelings enough to attend to another's experience. So when we talk about pastoral care, we're talking about compassion, and we're talking about empathy, not sympathy that turns it back to us. Empathy also avoids premature comfort or cheap phrases. We talked about that a little bit. And at the stage, the promise of presence is in the long run the comfort that sustains. This is a ministry of presence when we care for those who are in grief. Then they talk about encouragement to remember. Encouragement to remember as another mode of Christian care. We help people, encourage people to tell stories about their loved ones. There comes a time when that invitation is really vital. That person can't always do it right away. But there comes a time when caring persons insist on remembering. They insist on recalling memories that even if painful, need to be recalled because it can bring awareness to what they describe as the complicated composite of emotions, right? That constellation of emotions connected with the lost person. Caregivers gently nudge grievers, kindly but firmly, to acknowledge the reality of the lost and nurture a nuanced memory without simplistic canonization or demonization. A healthy conversation of memory will resist persistent use of the present tense when referring to what has been lost. Often we have complicated relationships with the people that we have lost. They were imperfect people, sinners and saints, just as we are. And so it's important when we recall all of the good memories. What's your favorite memory, or what was their favorite food that y'all like to share at the holidays? But you also want to acknowledge that they weren't perfect. And that is a really delicate thing to do. Typically, the person will give you the opportunity. Maybe they'll share something, well, he was kind of this way or she was kind of this way. And you could go, yeah, that sounds like that was really tough too. And kind of a part of just our human experience, right? And that's really important when they talk about a nuanced memory, because that helps with the integration of the grief, which takes us to reintegration. Reintegration is an expression of hope that often comes towards the end of intensive periods of grieving. The final goal of living through grief is to restore a self-depletedness by loss, to reach a new normal, to be able to resume previously significant relationships and activities, and to establish new patterns of living to take into account the loss that has occurred. One sees this when one has lost a spouse and they turn their minds towards the possibility of not having to be alone for the rest of their life, and maybe there is somebody else that God has intended for them to be able to share this time that they have left in this earthly realm with. It doesn't mean that God intended for the loss to happen. It's just that in the pain of the losses that are simply a part of our human experience, God provides a new opportunity. And once a person has been able to share their stories and tell their stories of the loss of their loved one, and honor the time that they had and all of its complexity together, that reintegration turns their mind in radical acceptance of the loss that has occurred and towards the possibility of what may be next in their time here on earth and with whom. Same thing with the loss of a job. Say, in my experience, there was this loss of my identity attached with being somebody who had worked in the theater since she was a child. And then the opportunity, as I integrated that loss, became what might be God calling to me to next. And ultimately, I think that's how I ended up becoming a pastor. It didn't happen right away. It took a lot of self-exploration with different things. But eventually, God does lead us into that next new beginning for our lives. So these are resources that are for you and your own personal understanding of grief as you care for the people that God brings to you and puts in your path. But it's also, this is a curriculum that can be used in your congregational context to educate others in your community about grief and create opportunities for conversation about grief and the losses that members in your congregation may experience. Again, I encourage you to bring this if this is something that kind of excites you, that gives you a sense of passion about something that you might lead for your congregation, to bring it to your pastor first, talk to them about it if this is something that you would like to do, and work together to see if this would be of support to whoever occupies the office of the pastor in your context, as well as if it's the right time from a more macro understanding of where your congregation is in their journey. All right, so that is grief. Now we're going to move on to images, pastoral care images. So in the same way that we talked about 3 different models of pastoral care, I'm offering 3 different images for your consideration. And these images work in conjunction with one another, work separately from one another, but they're terrific ways for us to understand the pastoral care as a whole. So we're just going to focus on the images. They all come from this wonderful book called Images of Pastoral Care by a guy named Dykstra. There are many images in here. There are many images for pastoral care. The classic images are the ones that we began when we talked about the father of pastoral care, Anton Boysen, the living human document. There were other ones, Living Human Web, Solicitous Shepherd. I pulled Alistair Campbell's The Courageous Shepherd from classic models to talk about. There's another one called The Self-Differentiated Samaritan. One of my favorites is The Wounded Healer by Henry Nouwen, so we will discuss that one. Other ones that you might be surprised at are The Circus Clown, The Wise Fool Reframed, The Intimate Stranger, The Ascetic Witness, The Diagnostician, The Indigenous Storyteller. There are many images in pastoral care, both contemporary and classical. The ones that I chose were The Wounded Healer, which we'll begin with, from Henry Nouwen, who many of you probably know. He's written a tremendous amount of devotions. He's a Christian mystic, and a lot of his work you will find in devotions published by Augsburg Fortress. The second one we'll explore is The Gardener by Margaret Zips Kornfeld. Margaret Kornfeld wrote one of the books that wasn't in the required reading, but was a recommended reading book called Cultivating Wholeness. It's wonderful. And then the third one is The Courageous Shepherd. I really like that one, and I hadn't explored that one. So I think that one from Alistair Campbell would be kind of exciting for us. So let's start, though, with one that we've talked about briefly, The Wounded Healer. So this is a quote. Let me find my place, though, in my book here. Here we go, The Wounded wounded healer. So we're going to begin with this quote. Our brokenness reveals something about who we are. Our sufferings and pains are not simply bothersome interruptions of our lives. Rather, they touch us in our uniqueness and our most intimate individuality. And as Nouwen would suggest, they are very useful for us as caregivers. Henry Nouwen came upon a piece of midrash from the Jewish tradition. It's an old legend in the Talmud. And this is where he got his inspiration for the wounded healer. I'm going to read you this old legend from the Talmud, and then we'll talk a little bit more about wounded healer. The legend goes like this. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi came upon Elijah the prophet while he was standing at the entrance of Rabbi Simran ben Yochai's cave. He asked Elijah, "When will the Messiah come?" Elijah replied, "Go and ask him yourself." "Where is he?" "Sitting at the gates of the city." "How shall I know him?" "He is sitting among the poor, covered with wounds." The others unbind all their wounds at the same time and then bind them up again. But he unbinds one at a time and binds it up again, saying to himself, "Perhaps I shall be needed. If so, I must always be ready so as not to delay for a moment." So the story reveals Jesus, the Messiah, sitting at the gates of the city, covered in wounds, unbinding one at a time and binding it back up, waiting for the moment in which he will be needed. And such it is with us as caregivers. We all have our wounds from our own losses in life. And as caregivers, we unbind those wounds one at a time, tend to them, and rebind them, for they will be useful in our caregiving to others. Nouwen writes, he is called to be the wounded healer, the one who must look after his own wounds, but at the same time be prepared to heal the wounds of others. He is therefore both wounded minister and healing minister. And these are the two concepts that he explores in this image of wounded healer. He begins by talking about the loneliness of the one who unbinds a wound one at a time to rebind in preparation to use his wounds in cares of others. He writes that the loneliness is especially painful. For over and above his experience as a man in modern society, he feels the added loneliness resulting from the changing meaning of the profession itself. I don't want to talk too much about this from a professional point of view because we are not professionals here. But there is something about how, when we are willing to use our wounds for the care of others, to be part of their lives, but not fully, because our wounds are ours and only to be useful for others in those caregiving situations, that can be deeply lonely. He notes that the Christian way of life does not take away our loneliness. It protects and cherishes it as a precious gift. It's the awareness of loneliness that is the gift that we must protect and guard, because our loneliness reveals to us an inner emptiness that can be destructive with when misunderstood, but filled with promise who can tolerate its sweet pain. And so that's the irony for those caregivers who want to touch the center of other people's lives, that we still find ourselves often on the periphery. In caregiving situations, I'll use myself as an example. Before I even thought about going into ministry, I found in my discernment and awareness that God kept bringing me people who were needing space for me to just listen to their pain, in the loss of a mother who had died of cancer, in the loss of them being diagnosed with cancer, the fear of that change in their lives, in the losses they were experiencing in the face of racism in our community and feeling excluded from community. I would listen bear witness to their pain, invite God's divine love to transform it. And often, when those individuals felt heard and seen and had received whatever they needed in order to incorporate those losses into their life, I wouldn't see them again, right? God brings us people to care for all the time, and they're not necessarily going to be part of our community in terms of our personal lives, our friendships. They're simply people that God brings to us to care for, and then they move on. And so when is talking about the loneliness of caregiving, that's what he's talking about. We're giving of ourselves and using the wounds of their lives in healthy and appropriate ways, not to sympathize, but to empathize with the individual seeking care. But it's not necessarily community building, some of those experiences for us personally. So he talks about how that which is perceived as a weakness, these binding and unbinding of one's wounds, this waiting at the gate and to care for other people, God transforms into strength. So God transforms the wounded healer into the healing minister. Making one's own wounds a source of healing, therefore, does not call for the sharing of superficial personal pains, which we talked about as being sympathy, a turning one to oneself. Oh, I understand that. But for a constant willingness to see one's own pain and suffering as rising from the depth of the human condition, which all men share. This is obviously written a long time ago, which all humankind share, right? We see in others' experiences, we talked about the awareness of oneself being super important with that, but that's what wounded healers do. We see in others' wounds our own, because these are simply like grief, all part of the human experience, all part of those losses that we share in. And he moves us into understanding hospitality and concentration as being two key components of this wounded healer image of caregiving. Hospitality. What does hospitality as a healing power require? It requires, first of all, the host to feel at home in his own house, in oneself, and one's experience with one's wounds. And secondly, that he create a free and fearless place for the unexpected visitor. Like I was talking about, all those people that just happened in my path and needed sacred space to share their story. Therefore, hospitality embraces two concepts, concentration and community. So we hear wounded healer being transformed into healing minister by acts of hospitality, concentration, and community. Concentration is what now one's using to describe what we were calling in our previous lectures active listening, which leads to meditation and contemplation, and therefore the necessary precondition for true hospitality. And as you look back over the slide deck that was previously shared, I really encourage you to look at that tree of contemplation. One can only do this work and do this work faithfully if one is truly centered in one's spiritual life. Otherwise, this work can become incredibly decentering, and one has to be very strong to be concentrating on other people's, to allow other people's pain and stories and to be able to enter into it through active listening. And so that it's really important to be also to practice meditation and spiritual practices in the contemplative life, so one can remain truly spiritually centered to offer true hospitality. That helps prevent us from withdrawing into ourselves, and to be fearless in receipt of others' stories. And then the last piece he talks about is community, and I just was going to read two pieces on that, which I hope is helpful in understanding this image as an image of pastoral care for lay leaders. A Christian community is therefore a healing community, not because wounds are cured and pains are alleviated, but because wounds and pains become openings or occasions for a new vision. And as congregations are seeking new visions for their life together in faith, I think this is an opportunity many of us might want to prayerfully consider. When loneliness is among the chief wounds of the minister or the caregiver, hospitality can convert that wound into a source of healing. Concentration prevents the minister from burdening others with his pain. That's that spiritual centeredness. And allows him to accept his wounds as helpful teachers of his own and his neighbor's condition. Community arises where the sharing of pain takes place, not as a stifling form of self-complaint, but as a recognition of God's saving promises. I think that sums it up. It's wonderful. And I would like for y'all to think about that articulation of loneliness, concentration, and community, and wounds as opportunities for healing in Christian community when you listen to that Frientimacy TED Talk. Because you'll hear points of contact between Nouwen's image of wounded healer and I think she's a therapist, video on Frientimacy. All right. In conclusion, Nouwen says this: to announce, however, that the liberator is sitting among the poor and that the wounds are signs of hope and that today is the day of liberation is a step very few can take. And that's really important when we're teaching and in some ways I feel like I'm preaching pastoral care for lay leaders. It requires a tremendous amount of self-evaluation to see if this is something that you truly feel that you are able to step into. And honestly, none of us, including your pastors, can step into this without recognizing that the one true liberator is Christ Jesus, who accompanies us in and through all things. If indeed we listen to the voice, Nouwen writes, and believe that ministry is a sign of hope because it makes visible the first rays of light of the coming Messiah, we can make ourselves and others understand that we already carry in us the source of our own search. Thus, ministry is indeed a witness to the living truth that the wound, which causes us to suffer now, will be revealed to us later as the place where God intimated his new creation. And in that, I am confident that you can see how Nouwen came to his image of the wounded healer for pastoral care, understanding our story as Christians with what Jesus did, working through the cross, what God incarnate did, working through the cross, bringing all into resurrecting new life. So that's a quick review of the wounded healer. If you'd like to take a break, we are hit at 42 minutes and 17 seconds and counting right now, and then pause the video and come back. Otherwise, we are moving forward to Margaret Kornfeld's image of Be a Gardener. I'm kind of curious, if we were together, I would be wondering how many of you have a garden at your church? How many of you are gardeners in your personal life? What is it you find that is a gift to you in gardening? Do you find that you draw closer to God in gardening on the land, whether it's in your home or on the property of your church? Do you, if you have a gardener, do you see garden? I'm trying to find my page. Do you ever see connections with that and what we hear in our scriptures when we're worshiping together? All of these pastoral care images come from, here it is, come from scripture. When you think about being a gardener, and we think about the Gospel of John, where there's the unrecognizable man in the garden that calls Mary by name, right? So resurrection happens in the garden there. We also obviously have the garden in Genesis. We have the new garden in the new city in Revelation. Lots of garden imagery throughout our Bible. Okay. So like the midrash from the Talmud that Henry Nouwen uses to ground his image of wounded healer for pastoral care, Margaret Zips Kornfeld uses a piece of writing from Julian Norwich, who is a medieval Christian mystic. And so this is Julian of Norwich's writing that inspired Margaret Kornfeld's image of Be the Gardener as a pastoral care image. Julian of Norwich writes, "Be a gardener, dig a ditch, toil and sweat, and turn the earth upside down, and seek the deepness, and water the plants in time. Continue this labor and make sweet floods to run and noble and abundant fruits to spring. Take this food and drink and carry to God as your true worship. So good. So good. We love Julian. She's wonderful. Yes, so she's a medieval mystic, and she understood this metaphor of gardening as an image for ministry. So Margaret Kornfeld talks about it from a counseling point of view because that was kind of her background. And she writes, counseling is always the healing interaction between counselee and counselor. I think we can understand this as caregiver and care seeker. Both we and the care seekers are rooted in the same ground because we are sustained in the same community. So she just talks about the community where we work. She says, that is why as gardeners who care for souls, we must first consider the community in which we do the work. The community of your church or your synagogue is the ground that supports and nurtures both you and your work and the individuals who are members of that community. She also writes that in this image of being a gardener, so the ground is our community in which we're tilling the soil and tending to the needs of people. She also notes that we're grounded in multiple relationships in congregational life, multiple relationships of people who come to us, that God brings to us, who are seeking sacred space to share their stories. But she also argues or articulates that community is not only the place where healing can happen, but it's the means through which it happens. And so that's where it's really important to understand community as the ground, right? It's the function of the ground is the same in our gardens, where the ground nurtures, supports, and holds the plants regardless of the composition of the soil. And as we understand more about how community works, we are both able to cultivate the soil and to rest and be supported by the ground, okay? And she was talking about that also in the context of community in varied religious traditions, okay? Community as a living organism. Well, we know that as congregational life, people come and go, and people change and experience all kinds of losses and successes in life, and it's always a living, breathing, malleable living organism. Part of how she talks about being a gardener as an image, or the garden as an image, the community is the ground of the work, the community supports and upholds us, and now we must consider what we as gardeners must do for the ground. She differentiates ground and soil as community and tradition. So she makes this distinction in her metaphor that the ground is the community itself, with all the properties that make it a safe, healing place. And the soil is our religious tradition and our expression of it. So the soil is like our inherent Lutheranism, right? And our inherent theologies of sinner and saint, and the priesthood of all believers, and the two kingdoms, right? So that would be part of the soil, our unique expression of the ground, both as the place and the people of healing space. And she invites our consideration of the community's care as emphasizing wholeness, which again, like her book, is called Cultivating Wholeness. As members ask, what does our community need to be? We will find answers through careful listening to both God and each other. And then so she says, after you know about the condition of the community, you can plan for a response. And this is great when you think about gardening, right? Once you know the condition of the ground that you're in, and you're looking at oh gosh, we put a garden in at this church, and let me tell you, that just took a lot, figuring out the ground and tilling the soil, right? In order to figure out how to grow anything. It took us 4 years. So you're imagining your ground in your as your community, and the same way that you have to test the soil and look at everything that's there, and you have to look at the lay of the ground, and then what the sun and its relationship and everything, you're doing the same thing with your community. And then you plan a response. You're helped in this response if you understand two fundamental principles known to gardeners. paying attention to balance, which we did not here at God's Love. We had to learn that. And expecting change, which was something else was important with all the rain that we kept getting, and then the lack of rain we kept getting. And we kept having to plan a strategic response to those changes. All right. Paying attention to balance. Gardeners seek balance. In one season, the ground needs to rest, and another it needs to be fertilized so a bumper crop can go. Finding balance in a garden can be a bit difficult. And if we know that in gardening outdoors for the cultivation of flowers and fruits and vegetables, imagine how complex it is in gardening a community, right? She writes that it can be like a gymnast on a balance beam who's always slightly in motion, focusing both inwardly and outwardly. And we talked about that when we talked about 1 foot in, 1 foot out, right? We talked about that with wounded healer image. Okay. Expecting change. Oh, we are so challenged by this in the church, right? I mean, we all are. We all are in our personal lives and the lives of our congregations. Gardeners know to expect change. And although they prepare wisely, they must always expect the change that nature brings. Oh, the rain or the lack of it that we struggled with our garden here at God's Love, right? When you apply these principles to community, you may ask how your community can become balanced, flexible, focused, and in movement. I love that. Balanced, flexible, focused, and in movement. How can you be more comfortable with change and in harmony with nature? The garden image really can guide us as communities of faith in truly understanding that delicate dance and bob and weave that gardeners do in, again, cultivating the land to be fruitful as we cultivate our communities to also be fruitful in the gospel. It also talks a lot about determining your tradition's healing gifts. You need to, some cases, uncover and recover the healing gifts in your tradition. Look at your tradition in the way a gardener looks at the soil, what mixture is in your soil. If you understand the composition of your community's religious life, you can learn how to make it more balanced and lively. So really, Margaret's using this gardener of image, and when she's describing being a gardener as an image of pastoral care, she's really looking at it from a holistic perspective. You can certainly take this and distill it down to a one-on-one pastoral care encounter, but she's talking about multiple pastoral care encounters in a community network of believers, which I think is another way we can look at pastoral care for lay leaders, is because you're participating in that community, and the image of the garden may be one of the more valuable ones then for us, if that is how we understand we may be called as lay leaders in pastoral care. Recognizing others' healing gifts. You are not alone, and it is necessary for you to grasp this truth. Caregivers and care seekers become susceptible to burnout when they believe they must do the work alone, and you will be more effective religious leaders in your particular context if you are able to realize the healing gifts of other members of the church. That's a lifelong lesson for us, right? It takes a village, and it takes a lot of gardeners in a large community, even in a small community. And then she talks about learning as an apprentice, she talks about this in regards to one's self, and this is how it connects a little bit with the wounded healer image. One's self is the tool that the community counselor, the community caregiver, uses in the work. It's the one's self that listens, empathizes, thinks, and connects. You use your own experience, remember the binding and unbinding of wounds, and your imagination. You use your woundedness, your strength, your faith. You use your doubts. You listen to your whole self, not just your mind, and you understand with your heart, while at the same time you apply the caregiving techniques and theory that we've learned, or you've learned, or learned through hopefully this course, okay? You must know yourself in order to continue learning about yourself. So you can see how Kornfeld's work really connects not just with Nouwen's work of Wounded Healer, but with Carrie Doring's book and some of the things we've talked about in the previous lectures from a very practical point of view. She continues talking about dealing with one's anxiety, recognizing that you are enough in and of yourself, a ministry of being with, that would be a ministry of presence, the bravery of counsel, and of growing in grace. And here we come back with this image of being a gardener in a community that it is a ground, in the soil that it is our tradition, okay? We grow in grace through this work. We do our part, we plan, we prepare, we keep our eye out for unexpected growth in and around our community of believers. And we recognize that by faith, right, we are allowed to say that the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, and is blessed to be the name of Lord. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Any garden, like the beautiful image that we see here, any garden grows by the grace of God, and we grow by the grace of God in our faithfulness of tending to others as well as tending to ourselves, which is where I'm going to end this, the last line of Kornfeld's text. Tending to the gardener ourselves requires that we pay attention, that we take pleasure in life, and that we allow ourselves to be found. And I just think that that's a wonderful way to understand what it means to be a gardener and to be a gardener in a community of believers. It is grace that brought me safe thus far, right? Okay. And then our third and final image. I wrote the Good Shepherd here. It's the courageous shepherd. There's only one good shepherd. The courageous shepherd. So this is considered a classic image. Kornfeld and Nouwen, even though Nouwen's work dated back to 1972, those were considered more contemporary pastoral care images. And the last image we have here is the courageous shepherd. And I thought that this picture of shepherding was about the closest I could get to it. You see a guy, he's carrying a big back. He's standing, pretty comfortably, but it's kind of on a edge of a rocky road. The sheep are kind of all over the place. He is alone. He has a stick. Often when we think of Good Shepherd imagery, courageous shepherd imagery in our Bible, the robes are white and clean. People are resting on the ground, comfortably taking in the sun with these beautiful bucolic sheep resting or prancing around. And our biblical images of shepherding is a little bit more complicated than that. We've almost sanitized shepherding instead of really understanding what a difficult, messy, hot, sweaty job that it is. Pastoral care by lay leaders and pastors is a difficult, hot, sweaty, messy job. Alistair Campbell begins Courageous Shepherd describing this image by describing the occupation of shepherding as hazardous. They have to move flocks over considerable distances. They have to move them from resting places to watering places. Danger lurks in those shadows of the valley in the form of robbers and wild beasts. They have to move sheep from daytime and also through nighttime. They're in remote places, far from home. They have to be skilled in shepherding through all of those different terrains, as well as in when a sheep would get hurt, caring and tending to their ailments. It is a very unsettled life. It can be a dangerous life because you are working in remote spaces. Shepherding is slightly ambiguous. They're kind of a shadow. Shepherds are shadowy figures often. And so that he's trying to correct from this kind of sanitized image of shepherding that we have to really the courage that it takes to be a shepherd and how challenging, dangerous, and sometimes messy the job is. And he begins with, Alistair grounds his image of shepherding, something that we're all very familiar with, we hear quite often, have heard over the course of our lives for a very long time, in a piece of text from the Old Testament, from 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 34 to 37. Your Majesty, David said, I take care of my father's sheep. Anytime a lion or bear carries off a lamb, I go after it, attack it, and rescue the lamb. And if the lion or bear turns on me, I grab it by the throat and beat it to death. The Lord has saved me from lions and bears, and he will save me from this Philistine. And in this, Alistair sees that element of courage based on trusting that God is going to save us. God, which seems, as he writes, most obviously neglected in modern accounts of pastoral relationships. But there's another feature of that shepherd's character: tenderness, skill in leadership, concern for wholesomeness, making up a rich picture of what it means to care. So, caring for others that God may give us who may cross our path can be messy. And it requires skill, which is why pastors often get lots of training and have to go back for more training in order to do this and do this faithfully. And why it's important, if lay leaders desire to step into the role of pastoral care to assist whoever occupies the office of the pastor, they require training too. It can get really messy, and it requires skill, tenderness, courage, and self-sacrifice. He quotes Isaiah 40, he will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those that are with the young. He cites Ezekiel, I will look for those that are lost, bring back those that wander off, bandage those that are hurt, and heal those that are sick. He cites Psalm 23. He lets me rest in fields of green grass. He leads me to quiet pools of fresh water. He gives me new strength. He guides me in the right paths as he has promised. A courageous shepherd cares for those who are despised, cares for those who are on the margins, cares for those who have wandered off, cares for those who, like these sheep here, are standing what seems like on the edge of a cliff potentially. You have to have courage to do that as a shepherd. And it's important to remember that there is only one good shepherd, and that's what makes this image quite complicated, because we as the body of Christ have to be careful to remember, in the same way that Christ accompanies us in the garden, Christ accompanies us as the wounded healer through the cross into resurrection, that the good shepherd accompanies us as the body of Christ, as courageous shepherds, caring and tending with tenderness God's people. Let's see here. This is where it applies for lay leaders the most. I thought this was a really important piece to pull out of the text that I'm giving you. The primary reference of the shepherd image is to Jesus' self-sacrificial love, which seeks a response from every one of his followers. Leaders and teachers of congregations have no special prerogatives in the central meaning of shepherding. We must learn to speak of the pastorhood of all believers and to explore the idea that each person has a call to lead in that special way characteristic of the Good Shepherd. When he says the pastorhood of all believers, he's referring to Martin Luther's the priesthood of all believers theology, that special soil, right, that we till, cover, and uncover in our own context here as Lutheran congregations in Bucks County. There is no pastorhood of all believers, but there is the priesthood of all believers that says that we all have a special role for the care of God's people and Christian community. And this is where Alistair Campbell calls us to be courageous shepherds, led by the one good shepherd in conjunction with our pastors and our congregations. His is a call for courage. And so he talks about there is courage in the words of Jesus, there is courage in the actions of Jesus, and there is courage in the sufferings of Jesus. And that's who we confess to be disciples of, meaning we confess to live in the discipline of the way of Jesus Christ. And so I think I'll close with the final paragraph here so that we can understand this image, the courageous shepherd, more clearly and our role in it. No single human being possesses the competence, the strength, or the vision to lay claim to the role of the Good Shepherd. But when it is our place to lead the way for others, there are two signs that our shepherding is true leadership. The first is that those who follow our lead find rest and health, not some narrowing, overburdening, or destructive version of themselves. And sadly, he notes that much shepherding in the name of religion has caused unwholesome results. The second sign is that true leadership is costly and dangerous. We cannot lead without risking ourselves. Indeed, it is most often out of our wounds that we bring wholeness to others. When we experience this second sign, the sign of the wounded healer, we also realize how little we can give of pastoral care and how much we ourselves need it. And so in that final paragraph, we can see how all three of these images work together and are interconnected in our understanding of pastoral care and pastoral care offered by lay leaders in Christian community. There may be one of these images that speaks more powerfully to you. It might be wounded healer, it might be a gardener, it might be the good shepherd or the courageous shepherd. And you'll get to play around with those as you read through these texts. But they are all interconnected, as we are all interconnected as one people of God. So I thought that would be fun to explore a few images for our work together, exploring pastoral care for lay leaders. For those of you who are using this in a more broader sense of your diaconal training, you will, I think, enjoy using these images as potential lenses for when you read the scriptures. So that concludes our lecture. We're locking in at 66 minutes and 50 some odd seconds. I look forward to being with you on Saturday, December 6th at 9 o'clock. I will be sending out a new Teams link for that meeting, recording it for everybody. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy this lecture, the TED Talk Frientimacy video, the readings of these essays for your own personal exploration, as well as your self-learning and growth through completing the genogram and verbatim. Thank you so much for taking this class. You are an absolute blessing. It is a joy to be with you in these series, and I look forward to seeing you on December 6th. I hope you all have a happy Thanksgiving. Be safe on the roads if you're traveling, and I pray that you have a wonderful time with family, friends, and your congregations. Take care.